This is Democracy in Lockdown, a weekly virtual conversation on the latest news about the coronavirus crisis and what it means for our democracy. This podcast is presented by Unlock Democracy. We campaign for a better democracy and a new written constitution built and owned by the people.
Hello and welcome to the fourth Democracy in Lockdown episode. My name is Sam Coates and I'm a campaigner at Unlock Democracy. I've also got with me here today.
Hi, I'm Matthew and I am Unlock Democracy's membership and fundraising assistant. Really happy to be joining you.
So we've kind of entered the hellscape of two millennial men on a podcast. I just want to say we're not planning to make a habit of this. We've got a balance over the series so far and we're planning on giving people a break every now and then. So Matthew, how are you managing to keep up with your family these days? Obviously, none of us will be strangers to using online tools to communicate with people, but we're being forced to do it for everything these days. So how are you managing to do that with your closest?
Yeah, well, it's actually quite tough, Sam. I'm quite far away from my family. I was planning to go back just a few weeks ago, but obviously I've had to shelve that. So we've had to be quite creative. I've been Skyping my grandparents. We've been using Zoom chats like this one for pub quizzes and that kind of thing. So we've been getting around. So I've written a pub quiz that we're actually holding this Saturday. So looking forward to that one. What about you?
Great stuff. Well, I'm in a slightly more fortunate situation than you because most of my family are quite close by. So I made the choice to temporarily move in with my mum for a little while before we get a house sorted out here in Cardiff. So see her every day. So that's great. My grandparents are obviously shielding about 10 miles away. So we're just trying to keep calling them as often as possible. Sadly, despite my efforts to get them to use Jitsi on their tablet, they haven't really managed to get the tech right for that. So maybe we've got some time to keep working on that with them. And how are you coping generally with lockdown, Matthew?
It's okay. I think as I've said to you before, I'm one of the lucky ones, really. But it's more being in the same small space, I think, and finding ways to sort of vary your day. I've discovered parts of my local neighborhood that I didn't know even existed because, you don't want to take the same walk every day. But yeah, I'm getting along pretty well. I'm doing plenty of reading, which is quite a nice bonus to it all.
Good to hear. Yeah, reading is something I'm definitely doing a lot more of, quite theoretical sometimes. Cool. So let's get going. Last week we talked about the UK government's attitude to scrutiny and accountability of its response to COVID-19 and how that reflects our hugely centralised political system.
Yeah, and this week we'll be talking about the latest developments in our democracy, and we'll also be taking a look at where we all see the future of our democracy in Britain heading. So that's looking beyond the lockdown. So we'll be listening to some of your thoughts later. I can't wait to get stuck in. So yeah, stay tuned for that.
Okay, so each week before we get stuck into the real substantial bit of the thing we're talking about, we go through a few of the news items that we've seen that are kind of really relevant to what we're talking about. So the Liberty Human Rights Group has called for authorities to focus on facilitating voluntary compliance with restrictions rather than ramping up coercive and oppressive tactics. There's concern that the normalisation of surveillance and the concerning techniques we've seen in recent weeks could have impacts which last far beyond the pandemic. We've also seen that testing capacity continues to run out within minutes of testing packs going online on the government's website. So healthcare workers are still in a massive queue to get the testing they need to stay in work. And obviously we've seen that pressure from business and from some parts of the Conservative Party to ease the lockdown is growing. And that's something that we should be very concerned about, where the evidence from the science is saying that we're not at the point yet where that is a sensible thing to do. We've also seen some really sad stories come out this week where hospitality workers that have been sacked in London are sleeping rough because they've fallen through the cracks of the support schemes and their landlords have just told them to go, and the support to get them into hotel rooms has just not been delivering. So that shows how there are still big holes in the safety net that the government has announced, and there's still no news yet as to how renters are going to be protected. And we're recording this on Tuesday, where a minute's silence has been observed for key workers that have died fighting the coronavirus. So let's kick off. So today we're talking about how we see the future of democracy and how the lockdown is going to change that. So Matthew, you've been running a survey of our supporters about what people's hopes and fears are about their own lives under coronavirus, but also what the future is for our political system. You found some really interesting stuff, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this as well, Sam, but also anyone's comments coming in. I've had a great time reading through hundreds and even thousands of responses, and we found some really, really interesting things. So we gave people about 5 days to come to us, and we got more than 1,000 responses. And it's been fascinating. We asked people quite a bit about their own personal experiences. Some of you will have shared some of your experiences with us, but also their insights on where political leadership and where leadership is going to come from as we go through this crisis together. And we've got some real insights for you. We've discovered that people really see leadership coming not from the very top, but from the very, very center of society and from its beating heart. So it's clear that people don't trust the government's response to treat people equally or fairly. 76% of people thought that the government response was either inadequate or much worse than that. And people were also very, very clear that those who have less wealth are suffering the most, whereas those who have more already are generally getting by better. So people can really see the inequality both in the way the crisis is affecting people, but also in the response that government is managing to provide in terms of policy. By contrast, and this is where it gets really interesting, people really see that their local communities and local government and charities, but also society as a whole, is responding really, really well in some cases to this crisis. And so there's this real disconnect between what people see coming from the very, very top levels of government and how people see their neighbours, their friends, and their family responding. And that's where we really get some really interesting insights.
Great, thanks, Matthew. And just to check there, are you saying that people are saying that they're not hopeful about the future of our political system, of our democracy, despite the fact that they're feeling quite good about the broader reaction among society and people's kind of organic ability to help each other in the community?
Well, I can hear the skepticism in your voice, and it is a bit of a weird one, isn't it? You're right. People were very overwhelmingly negative about the way that the government is responding now, but also when asked about the future of our democracy, people were very, very negative as well. It's clear that people are worried about government overreach. So some of the things that you were talking about earlier about civil liberties, but also the fact that various really, really critically underserved groups in society. So I'm talking about people experiencing homelessness, people who are survivors of domestic abuse, groups that don't get the coverage that they ought to get in the media most of the time. People are very, very worried that these groups are being underserved and are going to continue to be underserved in that way. And at the same time, people are relatively, not exclusively, but relatively positive about the future of our community and society going forward. And I think at first glance, those two things can seem to be contradictory. And so it'd be really interesting to sort of drill down a bit into what's behind that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's an interesting question that we'd love listeners to throw back at us, really, about why they see there being a disconnect between those two things. So what we've got here is people are really angry with are very unhappy with the way the government has reacted. We've already been talking about the amount of holes in the social safety net. Certain groups of people in particular that are already facing difficult times are really facing quite desperate situations under the lockdown. But people seem to have faith in their own communities. So mutual aid has been a really amazing story that's been popping up really within days of the lockdown happening and even before in some cases. So for where I am, for example, we've got a mutual aid group that covers just the ward that I live in. And we heard weeks ago that although it takes time for people to be aware that the group has happened and people need to get the leaflets to ask for help, there's more than enough volunteers for the need that people know about. So they're actually talking about what more creative things they could do to kind of enhance community cohesion and lessen people's sense of loneliness during lockdown. And I'm wondering kind of what political opportunities there are there for kind of making sure that we're demanding that the people that are not being helped get the help that they need. But we've got this really interesting thing here, I reckon, where people are confident in their communities, and I think many people are discovering their communities for the first time. Actually, there's been a couple of things I've been reading about how people didn't used to know their neighbours at all, but they've been having street parties. A few miles from where I live, there's villages where bunting's been going up, where people are having sing-songs during the NHS collapse every Thursday, and just a massive revival of community life that we maybe haven't seen for decades in some cases. But
yeah, I definitely echo that. And the mutual aid group, which covers my ward, we've also found that there are loads and loads of volunteers. And actually, one of the hardest things is finding the people who need the help. So yeah, experimenting with different ways of contacting people is going to be really important. But definitely, and I think one of the most exciting things about this maybe is that actually we're discovering that capacity to behave as a community, to act as a neighbourhood and protect ourselves and protect each other was always there. It never went away, and it was just sort of waiting to be uncovered. And so obviously in what is a really hard time for so many people, it's really exciting that we're rediscovering all of those energies. And like you say, it's really exciting to see how we might use those energies and harness them for social good.
Absolutely. And there's just one more thing I want to throw in here, really, which is that a friend of ours, Adam Ramsey, has written on Open Democracy recently about this idea that he calls the reification of politics. And this is an idea he's developed from basically talking to members of the public on the streets, both in the UK during Brexit referendum, but also at other times, and also in other parts of mainland Europe in more recent years. That people seem to think of politics as this thing that is happening on the TV, is happening somewhere far from them, and that politics is not something that happens in our community or something that we do together, how we negotiate, how we learn how to live together. Whereas maybe a century ago in a mining village, people thought of politics as the institutions they were building together to look after their communal welfare, so miners' halls, subscription services for joint healthcare, strikes, other ways of improving working conditions, and then there were obvious links to how that links to kind of national level politics. Whereas now the community work that many people still do is just not thought of as political in that way. So I think that says an awful lot about the way that alienation from politics has increased over the past decade, and there's been this emergence of a professional political class that kind of shuts off opportunities for participation, but also the kind of goalposts of what is actually possible to do, what options are actually on the menu in our democracy.
If you like this podcast, click the subscribe button and follow us on social media.
So what that seems to me is that our outdated, highly centralised political system is not providing space to thrive for all this community energy and capacity that it turned out was there all along to actually get reflected within the formal political system. So, Matthew, what do you reckon are the emerging impacts that this new thing that people are experiencing and the rise of mutual aid could have on our democracy? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I know what I want to happen. I want this to be the basis of a new sort of flowering and flourishing of democracy from the ground up. We want it to be the seeds of something altogether more powerful and empowering for people. And I think there's every chance that it could become that kind of thing. And in a sense, I think we're going to have to decide that for ourselves. There is definitely a sense that these mutual aid groups, whether they continue to exist in the same form or whether the networks that we're building now take a different form in the future, and whether those energies are turned to something different, there is definitely a sense that that network could be extremely powerful, and that people who weren't already involved in formal politics, they might not go to council meetings, they might not be members of a political party, but they might use those new networks to articulate their demands, the demands that they have for a better life, for better public services, for better jobs, for better working conditions, whatever it might be. And I think in a sense, it's going to depend on what the crucial organizers in those networks decide to do with those networks. And so for my part, and I'm sure for your part, Sam, it's going to be about making sure that we harness these energies in the most constructive way. And just one final thing I'd add on that is that I think those of us who are interested and involved in political campaigning already, so if you're a member or a supporter of Unlock Democracy, maybe you're involved in a political party, I think it's incumbent on all of us who are in that situation to make sure that we're definitely not getting in the way of people who want to get involved through these new networks, but that we're doing everything we can to empower them instead and make sure that we can harness those energies in a way that is really like positive and constructive. I don't know whether you have anything to sort of say about that angle of things, Sam.
Yeah, well, when the groups were first popping up in Cardiff, there was a little bit of chat going on about were some of the councillors or were some, established organisations trying to interfere with it and hold control over that. And I largely feel like that's not a thing that's happened. Like there was some fear about that, but I think on the whole, they've been allowed to thrive and new people have been allowed to take part. But I think that's a really important point. There's often a tendency where anywhere in the country, some citizens might decide to set up a campaign about something they're concerned about, and then like existing established political interest groups or organisations try to co-opt that, and that is often a really bad development for that campaign. That's absolutely something that we should discourage. I guess one thing I'd add is that I think one reason the energy for these groups has popped up so quickly is not only that it's an obvious emergency, but people have seen what's been happening over the 10 years of austerity that's happened. People know that there are huge gaps in social provision of services by the local state. My mum was made redundant last year from her teaching assistant job because of the ongoing effects of austerity at a council level. In the same way, social care is being hurt in the same way. Lots of so-called not statutory services to help vulnerable older people, for example, have been pulled across the country. So I don't think people have gone through that time without realising what holes there are. So I think part of the energy that has come about is people knowing that that's the case and wanting to make sure that is plugged. And other examples of that we've seen crowdfunders, both at a Welsh level, a Scottish level, and at an England level as well, to actually just directly buy PPE equipment for healthcare frontline workers who are just saying that this isn't getting delivered quickly enough. And that's obviously raised huge amounts of money and is really helping to put a dent in that demand. Now, I think there's a really interesting question between at what point is the immediate emergency thing kind of under control, or at least people have just to deliver that and we can start turning our energies to imagining we've got this new citizen power that has been helped by online organising. How can we use that to actually transform the political situation where the government hasn't prepared for a pandemic and their response has been too slow in terms of the safety net, in terms of PPE, in terms of just doing the basics that we need to save as many lives as possible. So it's going to be down to a lot of the organisers, as you say, Matthew, to imagine what happens next. But if any people happen to be listening to this, I would say realise how much power you have. And people who maybe thought that other people were a bit selfish or just wanted to keep to themselves are all discovering that that's not the case, that most of us really do want to live social lives and want a better society. So if we exert that power and make demands that we don't go back to the broken elements of the system that we had, then we can really push to change things for the better.
So yeah, that really chimes with me, and I'm sure it will chime with a lot of our listeners, like regardless of whether or not they've been involved in any of these efforts. And I think it's really exciting. It shows, as you say, that capacity to look after ourselves and look after each other was always there. Our neighbours aren't necessarily all scary. They do share the same hopes and fears as us. And it's been really heartening seeing so many people come together from different walks of life, different charities and social services, and really sort of connecting those different struggles that they've all had in their lives and really coming out with something much more positive. And I think there's a wider point to make here as well. And that's a point for participation in our society and in our politics. A lot of these people who are getting involved now, I'm one of them, are people who've often been put off by formal politics, by formal political systems, which haven't given them the representation they need. So it's going to be really interesting to see whether and how the people who are currently involved in mutual aid groups and other similar groups can really turn these bold, energizing networks into a really strong case for participation in politics in the near future. And not just participation in the old models, but actually creating new models of politics which can really harness those energies in a super constructive and exciting way, in ways that sort of create new possibilities for people.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think that what this is teaching us is that people want to participate. And if we have a political system that allows participation, then people are more than capable of that and don't need to be taught. People already have the capacity to do that. So we often think about participating in politics just as voting every few years, but that's actually not what democracy is. Democracy means self-rule, and people have spent 2,500 years discussing what specifically that means, but it means fundamentally that we should have far more participation every day by people in making the decisions that affect us. So if this level of participation for community support was transferred to the political realm, then the impact that could have, even under this really broken system, it's not something we can underestimate. That could really be a big driver for the change that we want to see. So does this describe what you are feeling? We've told quite a positive story. What are you seeing in your community? And is this something that you agree with, or is there part of the story that we're missing?
We've spent quite a lot of time talking to you just now, but we also want to hear what you want us to cover in the next few episodes of this podcast. We want to make sure that we're talking about the things that matter to you. So let us know by leaving your comments on social media and by tagging us using the hashtag #DemocracyInLockdown. If you'd like to read the full report of our COVID-19 listening survey, just go to www.unlockdemocracy.org.uk and go straight to the latest section. We'll also be putting the link in the description of this podcast, so look out for it there.
So if you're enjoying listening to us talking about these implications for democracy of lockdown, please join us and sign up for our email updates. Not only will you be the first to find out about new episodes, but you need to be with us for thinking about what this means for our democracy in the future and helping us to decide how we should campaign to change things so that we really come out of this with a stronger democracy. Thanks for listening. Until next week. Bye, Matthew.
See you, Sam.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll be coming back next Thursday with more. Remember, you can reach us on social media and tell us what you think we should discuss next week. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share. Stay home, stay safe.